In this video, I'll show you how you can use imperative logic written in JavaScript and running on the client to deterministically update the content in your ASP.NET Update Panel controls. To do that, fire up Visual Web Developer Express and let's build out first the sort of quintessential update panel demonstration. So I'll create a new AJAX Control Toolkit enabled website using the template, and then I will go down into my toolbox and grab an instance of the update panel control, drop it on my page. Then I'm going to scroll back up to my standard ASP.NET toolbox controls. I'm going to grab a label control. I'm just going to make sure we have plenty of space here. Notice I put label 1 inside the update panel, and I'm going to put label 2 outside the update panel. Then I'm going to grab ASP.NET button controls, and I'm going to put 1 inside and 1 outside the update panel. And change the name so we don't get an error there. The next thing I'm going to do is double click on my page so I can get a page load event, and then here in the page load event we're going to decide whether or not it's an AJAX style postback or not, and then format messages for the label controls that we placed on the page. So I'm going to take the script manager, and then I'm going to say if the script manager says this is a async postback, which means it's a AJAX style postback, then let's say label 1.text equal AJAX postback at whatever time it is. And let's do the exact same thing for the second label control. And if it's not an AJAX postback, let's just say it's a standard post or postback, right? So, and now let's run our application. So remember, this label's inside the update panel, this label is not inside the update panel. This button is inside, this button is outside. So if I click the button that's outside, it's a standard postback and we get the updated trace. Notice they synchronize together. If I click on the ASP.NET button that's inside the update panel, then we get an AJAX style postback and only the label that's inside the update panel gets updated. Super. But this requires the use of a server-side control. So in our case, it's implicitly the update method is implicitly triggered by the click event of the button. We can also use a triggers collection if we want to explicitly wire them up. However, what if we want to use JavaScript logic to update the update panel? So for the sake of doing that, I'm just going to need something to trigger some JavaScript logic. So I'm going to use an HTML button. So remember, this is just an HTML button, runs on the client side. It doesn't have any, it's not an ASP.NET control, doesn't have any server side, and it's not the button itself that is going to be responsible for causing the update. It's actually just some JavaScript code that I'm going to wire up to this button's click event handler. So I've done that this way. So I have a JavaScript function here. It's client side, and it's called when this button gets clicked. Right, so we're going to say call JavaScript. Remember, just the standard HTML button. It's not a server-side control. No C# VB behind it. And now what I need to do is wire up the page request manager. So I get an instance of it by saying var prm for page request manager equals sys webforms page request manager dot get instance, And now that I have a reference to the instance of the page request manager, now I can say prm dot do postback. However, my postback requires an argument, and that argument needs to be the identifier of a control that causes the update of our update panel. So in our case, the button 1 control lives inside the update panel, and we'll wire that up as the control that we're going to pass in to the do postback method call. So now, if I go ahead and click on our button, so the button, remember the fact that we're clicking on a button is irrelevant. We're just calling some JavaScript. So when we call that JavaScript method, we get this AJAX style postback, not a full page postback. However, this only works because we pass in the identifier of a control that is wired up to the update panel's update logic. If I were to pass in a control identifier that was on the page but was not part of the update panel's updating mechanism, we'd get a different set of behaviors. So if we run this now that I've changed that to button 2, remember button 2 is outside the update panel. Now if we call that JavaScript, we get a full page postback. Now the obvious question here, and frankly it was a question I got stuck on at first, was what if I don't want to have server-side controls in my update panel? What if I just want to have content? Well, thanks to Dave Ward, who runs this blog in Cosia.com, and you can notice that we had an email dialogue the last couple of days about using JavaScript to update panels, and he's written an interesting post about it here. But he actually sent me the technique that I want to show you, and the technique is to actually pass in the update panel's own identifier as the argument to the do update method. In order to do that, however, we first need to implement server-side logic for the update panel. So the update panel is a server-side control, even though we think of it in terms of its client-specific behaviors. So to do that, I'm going to wire up an onload event handler for my update panel, and it's just going to be a null op, so it gets executed. It handles the load event for update panel. I'm not actually going to do anything in there. And then I can make another JavaScript function, and in this case I'm just going to set up another button. But remember, the fact that we're using a button is irrelevant. We're really just talking about using JavaScript code. And we're going to want a new JavaScript function. Now, the other thing to remember here is that I'm not adding conditional logic here, but this is where the power of this. The power happens here because you can add conditional logic. So you can say, if this condition equals true, then update the update panel. Otherwise, don't bother. And that's where the power of being able to do this explicitly in JavaScript comes in. So I'm going to change button 2 back to button 1 because that's the one that actually works. But instead of button passing in the identifier of one of the button controls here, I'm going to pass in the identifier of the update panel itself. All right. So now if I run, right, I can pass in button 1, but I can also, let's do a standard one just to reset it. I can also use Dave's method to pass in the update panel's identifier as the argument to do update, and that works just great. And what that means is that back here in my user interface, I don't have to have server-side controls that cause the update. I can cause the update of my update panel with just client-side JavaScript code. So let's run that one more time just to prove that it works. So notice no actionable server-side controls, and that works just great. So the power here again is that you can now make decisions to really improve the efficiency of your application. You can make the decisions as to when to use client-side logic to update the content in your update panel, and you don't have to have actionable ASP.NET controls in your update panel, and that also means you don't have to do any of the sort of invisible control, sort of kludgy type solutions that some folks have used to force this to happen. And that's it. That's how you can force the update panel's update method using your own imperative client-side JavaScript logic.